You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. We are here today, as always, with Lord Uther, and John Bender joins us today of course, the Breakfast Club, and myself, UrzaMaster. We welcome you back to our continued journey into Strange New Worlds. This time, we're coming up after Season 1 with Season 2, and we're going to kick into it with Episodes 1 and 2. Now, some may question, fellas, why we're lumping two episodes together. And I have to say, one, I like to think that they're going with a lot of these two-parter episodes. We'll elaborate more on that later. And two, our very own John Bender here had an unfortunate spill going down the steps at his house. So glad you're doing all right, sir. Let's kick it to you, no pun intended, for a little bit of background on Episode 1, Season 2.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to you at home. Yes, indeed, we are launching a brand new season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which premiered on June 15th and will run throughout the summer, culminating with the season finale in August. August 17th is the big ticket to watch. And we will be recounting for you, going forward, week-by-week recaps of everyone's favorite new Star Trek show. Just a reminder, and to prime the pump for Season 2, let's take a quick back look at the show's creators and principal cast. The show was created by Akiva Goldsman, Alex Kurtzman, and Jenny Lumet. The executive producers and showrunners are Akiva Goldsman and Henry Alonzo Myers. There has been no behind-the-scenes turmoil that would cause the creatives to miss from one season to the next. So you see already early on in the second season a nice balance and flow from the past episodes that we were able to enjoy last year. I do want to shout out briefly to this tremendous ensemble, which has only taken 10 episodes or so to really gel as a crew, as a family, as a community, and with individual actors able to pass the baton seamlessly within scenes and within episodes and so forth. They're just doing some really fabulous work, and it's one of the, I think, quickest to congeal Star Trek casts when you look back over the long history of it or so forth, where it might have taken Next Generation a season or two to really find their sea legs. DS9, some argue, really got going in Season 2 and beyond. But by the time we hit the ground running here, we already are invested in these characters. We care about them. We want to learn more about them. And thankfully, the writers and producers are granting our wishes. Anson Mount is our fearless leader, Captain Christopher Pike. Ethan Peck plays the half-human, half-Vulcan Spock, and he is the grandson of legendary actor Gregory Peck, who, amongst all of his great credits, was also featured in Mystery Science Theater 3000. Jess Bush has a spirited interpretation of Christine Chappell. Christina Chong plays Lon Noonien Singh. Celia Rose Gooding is Nyota Uhura. Melissa Navia is helmsman Erica Ortegas. Babs Olusanmoko is Dr. Joseph Mabenga. And Rebecca Romaine is Unachin Riley, a.k.a. Number One. And we finished last season with a bit of a cliffhanger. In the final sequence, before we went away for summer vacation, Una was apprehended by Starfleet, having been unmasked as an Aurelian, and thereby in Starfleet against regulations. And Christopher Pike vowed that he would not let this go sitting down. And that's how we ended season 1. A little bit later in tonight's episode, we will find out what happened to Una and Christopher Pike and all of that. That was in episode 2. But first, the kickoff season, directed by Chris Fisher and written by showrunners Henry Alonzo Myers and Akiva Goldsman. That same creative team did the final episode of season 1, and then naturally came over and did the first episode of season 2. It's called The Broken Circle. And in a nutshell, we pick up several threads from season 1 to launch the new storytelling. The child who survived the Gorn attack in episode 9 of season 1, Oriana, she was the reason that Lon left the Enterprise temporarily to try and reunite her with her family and her kin elsewhere in the galaxy. So that storyline is picked back up as they have now ended up on a Klingon mining planet. And the Federation and the Klingons have a power sharing arrangement, but it's still some rough country there. And Lon sends a distress signal to the Enterprise, which is huddled up in space dock and needs their help. And with Captain Pike temporarily turning over command to Lieutenant Spock, so he can go and get a good defense lawyer for Una Chen and her legal woes, it falls upon Lieutenant Spock to keep the crew together and make sure nothing goes wrong for the next few days. And sure enough, his first order of business is to steal the Enterprise from space dock in a delightful recall of Star Trek III. And we always like it when the crew has no choice but to steal the Enterprise and go off on their own merry way. We're also introduced to a potential new head of engineering, while we still mourn the death of engineer Hemmer, who sacrificed himself in a Gorn attack last season in episode 9. We have the delightful and downright weird Carol Kane, comedienne, who comes on with an accent that can best be described as original. And she is part of a team of auditors and inspectors on the Enterprise who ends up going along with them when the ship is stolen. And my understanding is that she will be a reoccurring guest star throughout the season. Probably not in every episode, but we will be seeing more of her unusual Pelia, I believe was her name, throughout the show. So welcome, Carol Kane. Last glimpsed punching the hell out of Bill Murray with a toaster in 1988's classic Scrooged. So the main storyline of this is a M'Benga and Chapel storyline. There are dastardly factions of the Federation and the Klingon Empire who were defeated by the Federation in a bloody war that took place before we started Strange New Worlds. You can actually catch many of those exploits in season 1 of Star Trek Discovery. But war is always good for business. And the shadowy cabal known as the Broken Circle is trying to jumpstart the conflict again in order to make a profit and continue hostilities between these races. And so the central plot is Spock and the crew of the Enterprise, minus Pike and Una, have to try and stop these militants from basically launching a false flag operation to get Starfleet and the Klingon Empire back into a hot war. And we'll jump along with some of the plotting there. But primarily, M'Benga and Chapel are given a whole new side to them that we did not explore in season 1, as they are both Klingon War. They have served in it together. And this show touches upon the PTSD of war survivors, as well as what levels they're willing to go when enlisted to fight the cause again. And I'll start there with you guys in terms of, again, Christine Chapel presented as sort of a light, flirty, intelligent woman, flirting with Spock in season 1 and having the quips. M'Benga as a family man, working to save his daughter from an incurable disease, and a rational man of science. But we see a whole different side to them in this episode, both emotionally and physically. And it's very strong stuff for a season opener for Star Trek. The level of violence, it reminds me of some great, Japanese thrillers, including Old Boy, one of the all-time greats. I'm interested in how you guys felt. This basically a brand new dimension, opening a new door for both of these characters, whom, like I say, we kind of previously saw at this level, and now we've kind of done it where all of a sudden this is a whole different side to them. So I throw it over to you, Ursa, and what did you think of M'Benga and Chapel in the Broken Circle?
Oh, I loved it. This is again. We talk about great opening episodes of seasons with regard to Star Trek, and there are a lot of them. A lot of great two-parters, which I feel this is the first half of a two-part episode, or the second half if you want to look at the last season cliffhanger as sort of the cliffhanger type episode. But this particular continuity of characterization is just outstanding. I think you picked up on the Chapel-M'Benga relationship having deeper ties than what season 1 presented us with. I think it definitely laid some foundation, as any good first season will do. And the acting, as has been the new standard, it seems like, with these Paramount Plus productions, has been simply outstanding. And I would actually put this character development ahead of Picard seasons 1 and 2, because a lot of their, aside from Girardi, I think a lot of their characters remained relatively flat, or ended up being kind of disappointing, like Rafi. Although I think that was just due to the fact that season 3's Rafi really didn't need to be there.
Right.
And it was more of a nostalgia show, but did okay, even so. But these two characters, I think the whole time you knew there's more than meets the eye to these characters across the ship. There's all these looks and these characterization moments, just with camera angle and just facial expression and subtext. Really, I mean, very strong subtext, and just it's not inviting fan fiction necessarily, because I think of shows that are super popular that have all this subtextual analysis. Look at Supernatural, ran for 15 seasons. Tons of people had tons and tons of I bet this character is involved with this other character in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, half the time it was true, just not in the way that anybody predicted. This show, I think, plays really, really well into setting up character connections in a very realistic way. You would expect two people who work as medics together, who are exploring strange new worlds. I mean, title, to have some sort of military combat background. I mean, that's who you would trust to do that. If you were Starfleet and you were staffing your exploratory class ship, you would want people with deep connections. These are people who are going to be close quarters for long, long periods of time. You need a crew that can function as a crew. And what better than pairs or segments who have all these crisscross histories? And I think as we get in episode 2, we'll see more of that. But I loved it. I thought it was great that they didn't just show, as we see in the original series, sort of the blood feud of the war, but some of the good side of the outcome of the war, some of the diplomacy and some of the subtle, workings around these issues that we see in shows like DS9 and Voyager, and to some extent Next Generation. I think they're leaning into all the strengths that past shows have had, while avoiding some of the obvious, they could have done that, like Trouble with Tribbles, great episode, but pretty much you knew it was going to come to a pissing contest at some point, which was going to turn into a fight, which was going to upend the delicate balance of peace in at least that episode, if not far-reaching. Here we go again. They had every opportunity to do another Trouble with Tribbles here and upend a very delicate piece. Even if it's just on a planetary stance, they could have done it. And instead found a way to write themselves into this beautiful story that unfolds between these two foxhole comrades in arms who literally, they hit every sci-fi space battle trope in this episode. And lest we forget, they're competing with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which uses some of the same stuff they use in this episode. So it's not exactly like new material. They're not breaking a whole lot of ground, but they're doing it in a very Star Trek way, and in a way that kind of just makes you feel warm and fuzzy in a sci-fi, rich environment. So they're not directly competing, they're just leaning into the strengths and into the good feeling. And I loved it. I cannot gush enough about all of what I saw in episode 1. Just, lovely.
I'm going to pick apart one little piece of it, but I'll get to that in a second. I think it's a great point by Mr. Bender that usually when you watch old Trek seasons or episodes, it does. It takes a year or a season or two for them to all gel together. Like I felt with Next Generation, it took them until season 3 for them to really find that cohesiveness and kind of hit their stride. Where here, right out of the gates, right? Season 1, we know exactly what we're getting. And I think that's a big deal, especially to your point, Urza, about you only have 10 episodes anyway, even though we know how passionately you want to see this go to on-air TV and have your 40-some episodes, whatever it is. So I do think that's important. I also think it took a lot of guts not to have Pike in a sense, he's really not in this episode.
No.
Yeah.
To me, it's really a Spock episode and a Chapel and Bega episode, but I think it takes guts to take your captain, within the first couple of minutes, just out, right? I like that we're seeing Spock grow up in front of our eyes, in a sense. Peck is so good that, and I'm going to jump forward and I'll jump back again. The second episode, which I know we're going to talk about, I thought at one point he was Leonard Nimoy. There was one scene, he said something, the way he was standing, I'm like, this guy, he's nailed it. He's got Spock down pat perfectly, which we talked about before. But I think it was really cool to see him take control of the ship and see him, again, we're seeing him grow up. And I think that's an important piece too. I like the whole the angle of, that PTSD, that shell shock, that Chapel and the Doctor have. The only thing I struggle with a little bit is it felt like an episode of The Boys where they inject themselves with something and now they're superhuman for a few minutes and they can kind of keep up with the Klingons and fight them. It's the only part I struggle with a little bit. It felt kind of Matrix-y in a sense.
Yeah, it's true.
Matrix was great, but the one thing that the Matrix kind of ruined is the slow-mo kind of shots that we see all the time now to kind of accentuate movement and those pieces of choreographed fight scenes. Yeah. So I just struggled a little bit with them injecting themselves, but if that's my only complaint about an episode, I think that's pretty good, because the rest of it, they just nailed it. Go ahead, there, Mr. Bender.
I think what struck me in those sequences was they allowed M'Benga to really, for lack of a better term, whether it was the fluid he injected or his horrific memories of the war, he was a physical force. He was John Wick. He was uncaged in his rage. And I also think that they touched upon that with Spock. from the previous season, Spock now wrestling with his inner anger and turmoil. So I thought this whole episode was a nice comment on, people who are very much trying to maintain a calm, forward, rational, logical point to the world, and yet sometimes these circumstances, drive them past that line to just sort of a berserker. And so I thought that was a fascinating note to play because, that's not what we're going to be seeing M'Benga playing most episodes. So I thought it was interesting that they allowed him to become this physical force, and just, you could just feel all of this buildup from the previous encounters with the Klingons. Other quick hits, we're talking about Spock. He's got a line. If Pikes is hit it, we now have a line for Spock. When he's sitting in the captain's chair, and it's delivered masterfully, to quote, "I would like the ship to go now," which I just thought I had to rewind it twice just so I could laugh some more. And there were big FX. They contrasting with episode 2, where we had a much more smaller and intimate setup. They came out of the gate with, effects that still make William Shatner's efforts in Star Trek V look puny and unimportant. But the Enterprise tracking the Federation ship they've cobbled together to try to prevent it from the Star Trek motion picture model Klingon ship, which I love to see. Too often we see the Birds of Prey or these other ones, but here's an old school Klingon destroyer there. And then Spock communicate or back and forth with the Klingon commander saying, why should we believe you, Federation? And then toasting Bloodwine, another just fantastic comic moment. And I know UrzaMaster was pleased that we've reverted back to traditional Klingon prosthetics and makeup rather than the detour they may have taken in Discovery. These are the Klingons you know and remember. And so I thought that was a nice.
I love how they've blown that off pretty much, and they've literally said online, we're just ignoring what happened in Discovery,
Right.
And I think that's great. I love that they're just like, meh, whatever. And another thing too, which we've kind of talked about before a little bit, I've almost forgotten that there's another crew that's going to be on this Enterprise at some point. They've established themselves so well that I'm not sure when I want Scotty to join this crew. I'm not sure when I want Bones to join the crew. Like, there's a lot of those pieces that I'm okay with this right now. Like, I'm enjoying this. This crew has established themselves so much with great writing, like we continuously talk about. For you to forget, because I think that's a part of it too, right? Like when Next Generation came out, I remember thinking, well, this isn't Kirk and Spock and McCoy. How am I going to enjoy this? And then it took a while for that to happen, right? And then DS9 came out, and I'm like, well, this is no Next Generation. It's.
I remember
but
those.
Here, yes, we had a few conversations about that. But here, like right off the bat, just totally taken in, and I just think that's for people that love Star Trek, I think that's a big deal. And I think it's a testament to what they've done. I'll stop.
Spock, Chapel to bring. It's a triangle. Who are we rooting for? Go.
Oh, Chaplin to Pring.
Okay, yes, obviously that was the most.
Well, I'm trying to blow that off a little bit too, because we don't see that in the original series, right? So I'm trying to suspend my belief in a sense that, wait a second, there's no sign of it in the original series. And I do think I think they're very forward focused. And what I mean by that is, I think they're trying to stay true to the canon material, right? That should be coming up ahead in terms of the original series. So that's why I'm trying to figure out where they're going with some of that, because there's no sign of that in the original series. Go ahead.
I mean, I think they have an episode where they talk about T'Pring in the original series, but
But the chapel thing though.
yeah, Nurse Chapel. I mean, I think the one thing I will say is there is some interaction with Nurse Chapel and Spock in the original series that kind of hints that maybe there's a history there, and they never touch on it. So, like, I would really enjoy seeing that love triangle play out in some way, shape, or form. I have a feeling it probably one relationship ruins the other, which in turn ruins the other, and
Right.
you know, that's just how it goes. Which is a great. It's great. I mean, if that's exactly how it happens, you know, over the next however many seasons, fantastic. I think it's a great angle. What I like about Spock in this episode is it 100% like legitimizes what we see in the menagerie. You would never, watching the original series, expect Spock to just suddenly steal the Enterprise. It's completely out of character to the point where it almost feels like cheap, you know. And I think that episode in some ways got criticized because it just didn't seem like Spock, especially until you get to the second part where stuff kind of comes together and makes sense. You know, and then it suddenly is great. But now having this as backstory, where it's like, I see Spock is not just a man of duty, but a man of honor, which of course gets validated with his toast with the Klingons. I loved how they tied that up with a nice bow. I also really enjoy La'an in this episode, who, despite being sort of the catalyst of how this all goes down, really isn't involved much in the episode. But it does kind of give a foil to Khan, and I think they're going to consistently build that throughout the series. Is that La'an is everything that Khan is not. La'an is caring. La'an is, you know, open and welcoming of others, as opposed to, you know, exclusionary and exclusive, and, you know, a conquistador in a sense. So I really enjoy the character building they're doing here, and the investment and time that they're putting into this to just sort of legitimize these characters, so that you do automatically buy in to the fact that this is just the crew of the Enterprise. The only thing I'll have to say is that it makes me a little sad, because one, we know what's going to happen eventually, and two, we also know that to get this buy-in, it's kind of built around the fact that it's a callback. It's a prequel. And it makes me wonder, could you do another Enterprise-based series removed from the canon we know? You know, if we do indeed get a Star Trek Legacy, you know, and they're on the new Enterprise, will we see an Enterprise in the future with a non-legacy crew? Will there be a next generation after that picks up the ashes of, you know, the Picard family, or is, you know, the Picard the new Kennedys that just keep showing up on every Enterprise? You know, who knows? But I love that they're investing, you know, the time and energy to create a prequel canon that is both interesting and unique, without compromising the future. Like, they're still sticking to the fact that, you know, all this is going to play out to TOS at some point. You know, and I think that kind of leads us into how they bring this back around with one of our favorite tropes in episode 2. So for a little more on episode 2, I'm going to kick it over to Mr. Bender again to give us some background.
All right. So episode 2 does indeed settle the Una Chin Riley Irillian storyline. The episode was Ad Astra per Aspera, which translates to the stars through hardship. It was directed by Valerie Weiss and was solo written by Dana Horgan. And if you were impressed with Miss Horgan's writing in this episode, she will return for a couple more later this season. Basically, Una is she has flummoxed Starfleet, and they want to cut a deal. And if she agrees to the plea bargain, she won't face any prison time. She'll get a dishonorable discharge, and she can just live her life as a civilian. And you can read a lot of current political metaphors for the disenfranchised group of your choosing, in terms of what she's represents. But the fact it doesn't foreground it in such a way that you're rolling your eyes and saying, "Oh, she's just a stand-in for immigrants or LGBTQ," or I mean, we take it on its own terms for the story, what her conflict is, and most importantly, she's not a passive defendant. She's not somebody where this is happening to her. She is actively driving this case through her own motivations, and with that of her civil rights lawyer, who is a mesmerizing actress, Yetide Bataketi. I'm sure I said that wrong. She made an impression in Starz's American Gods. She also appeared on NBC's This Is Us. But she took a guest starring role in this episode, and we may never see this character again, or she may pop back up in future episodes or future seasons. But she made the most of her 57 minutes, and I can say, as someone who appreciates good character work, I couldn't take my eyes off this attorney, this fellow Aurelian who agrees reluctantly to defend Una in this tribunal. She was fantastic, and she was ferocious, and she was opinionated and calculating, but also transparent. And I think her cross-examination of Admiral April was just, spot on. Now, it's very easy in these shows to sort of favor one side or the other, to make the defense's case that much stronger than the prosecution's case, and so that you, the audience, are naturally going to be rooting for one side. To its credit, the Federation's case against Una, while doesn't have the same rich emotional resonance of her backstory that we later come to discover, it's, on its surface, a very logical, very facts-forward presentation of why she should be drummed out of Starfleet. Like, you may not agree with it. You may want Una to stay and be a part of the Enterprise crew, but when they present their case directly, you have to look at it, with the legal rigor and say, yeah, I mean, they've kind of got him dead to rights here. This is a case about the law. She broke the law. She's pleading not guilty, but also that she did what she said she did. So it's interesting that they do try to give you a sort of a both sides of the argument throughout the story. They don't make it so that the prosecution is blown over with a feather, if you will. And I'll leave you guys to discuss the nuances too. There are many television shows that have used this format before. Two of the most memorable from the Star Trek canon. In season 2 of The Next Generation, The Measure of a Man, in which Picard had to defend Data from being disassembled and that he was just the property of Starfleet, and had to actually prove that he was, a sentient being that did not deserve that fate. And season 1 of DS9, Dax, which had a very provocative premise in which a previous host of the symbiote, Jadzia Dax, was responsible for a murder and was accused of the crime, except now the symbiote is in Jadzia, who never committed the crime, and Commander Sisko had to defend his old friend. So Trek is known for, springing on topical, powerful courtroom, this or that and so forth. And once again, we sideline Christopher Pike to a degree. He does get some business in the beginning, trying to recruit the lawyer, but he's basically sort of a witness here. And they do a nice job of saying why he can't be on the stand. Because again, our impulse would be put Chris Pike on the stand and let him talk about the merits of Una. But they dispel with that pretty quickly. And they also dispel early on when they're trying to gather evidence for her defense, and Lon approaches Uhura about breaking the rules, to try and get some ammunition for the defense. And Uhura talks her down, even though she's a superior officer and is giving her an order. So the writing in the show by Dana Horgan, it cleverly opens these doors that we think, oh, well, that'll be an easy way out for them, and then it slams those doors closed right away. And so you're like, well, they're really going to have to work to get to where they want to get to here. This isn't just going to be, you know, two-dimensional writing, or just, we could have connected those dots from Act One. So I thought that was very good that they sort of set up expectations and then quickly reverse those expectations for us. I'll let you guys go. Innocent or guilty? How did you guys read Una's tribunal and how it was handled?
Well, this is, again, classic Trek. I was very impressed that they brought the idea of a significant main character on trial for something that is, obviously ridiculous. Like, you're obviously going to think, like, there's no way that they're going to... And then still takes you through this emotional roller coaster, even though you probably kind of know, like, they're not just going to write Rebecca Romaine off like this. It's too big a name, like, but they, unlike most episodes, if not all episodes of any of the Law and Order type shows or Law and Order itself, like, they don't beat you over the head with, this is the bad guy and they did this and now here's how we prove it, and it's super obvious how we prove it because every episode's exactly the same for 40 seasons. This instead takes, a fairly nominal approach to the legal aspect of it. It's more of sort of putting the morality of Star Trek on trial. Even though they keep trying to steer away from it in the courtroom, it's like, no, like, this is a moral issue. Like, this is something that they need to address, and yet we know from DS9, original series, Next Generation, we know that this is all still in place. So it's like, this is pretty big. They can't topple this. How are they going to treat this? Like, there's no, like you said, easy out. There's not even like a hard out. For most of this episode, I was like, what are they going to end up doing here? Because I don't see Starfleet backing down, and you get, of course, an angry Vulcan, or a very poor demeanor Vulcan, who's like logically upends their whole. Here's our solution, right at the tip of the iceberg, and it's just incredibly layered writing. And yeah, it was, for me, even a little obvious, that they were making allegory here. But I honestly wasn't bothered by it because that's what Star Trek is all about. And it's very valid for Star Trek to tackle a situation like this. Again, you can almost choose your disenfranchised group, but I think there's one in particular that they're singling out, but to each their own. And I don't think there's any loss of validity no matter which group you assume Una to be part of. The other side of it is, like, you also get this feeling that, like, as immoral as their stance may be, they're not, like, completely, leaning into a fascistic view. Like, they're still trying to be these, how do you want to put it, like, moral, high-standing, like an elf culture.
The thought process isn't out of line.
Yeah.
When you really think about it, it's not like they're wrong for thinking that way. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to throw that in there.
Run with it.
No, you're absolutely right. So yeah, they validate pretty firmly, like this is not based in simple bigotry. There is, honest commitment here, and I think that part of it is what pulls you back from, like, feeling like you're being beaten over the head with, well, obviously this is this or that group that they're, because there's always the people, and I don't know that we've touched on this before, but there's always the people who cry woke and don't want to watch because they're like, oh, they're beating us over the head with XYZ message from whatever angle. And it's like, well, yeah, in a way, sure, you could say that, but this episode legitimizes it to Star Trek by presenting it in a manner where it's like, no, this is not just based in some, simple holier than thou stance. Like, they have a history of genocidal war. Direct corollary, like, there is real caution there, and even the Illyrians, like, the lawyer talks about it. Like, yeah, the Earth experienced something horrible and traumatic, and it makes sense that they've done this. However, this is a cultural thing. This is not Earth we're talking about. This is the Federation. This is greater than just Earth-based Starfleet. And that's where I think we really get some redeeming, like, non-politicized sci-fi material. Even though it's definitely still political, as all of Star Trek is, because Gene Roddenberry, wrote it about the Cold War, essentially. It's always going to have an element of that, but I think for the most skeptical fan who might have an issue with this episode, you have to realize that they are directly dealing with Star Trek canon more than any other political angle. And that's what I think keeps you from losing your suspension of disbelief. Because I, for one, even if I agree with whatever point the show is making, if they're taking a club and beating me over the head with their message, I can't stand it. I lose interest in that show, that movie, that franchise pretty close to right away. And I would pause it very heavily, because I'm sure this is going to be controversy to come tomorrow morning, that this episode does a phenomenal job of keeping it Star Trek enough that it kind of shuts down the argument that there's any one group that's so clearly being represented that you feel beat over the head with wokeness.
I love when Spock and the other Vulcan are talking at the table, and they're watching them, and he comes over, and that's the scene where he reminded me of Nimoy, because he puts his hands behind his back, walks over, and his tone and the way he apologizes, which was funny, it's hilarious, but man, did that reek of like a Leonard Nimoy posture and line. It was just great. It was just so great to hear and to see. Again, kudos to the point of we don't get a lot of Pike in this episode, and that's okay. But when we do get him, it's in a I feel like it's a family setting, right? I think that's the other thing they really harped on this episode. Not harped, but we're building. Maybe that's a better way to put it. They're all sitting together watching the trial, and the looks that they share, the concern on their faces, it's like they've bonded. To Mr. Bender's point, they've off. You can tell that even off screen, they've bonded because of the way they look together on scene watching the trial. It's right. Very evident that they've created this bond, and I think that's, again, I think that's a big deal when it comes to the series. It's also kind of scary. There's only 8 episodes left, because I feel like there's so much ground to cover. We're gonna get some kind of a Gorn war, I think, at some point, or it would be a disjustice if we didn't. What I really would like to see is they end the season and do a movie that's a Gorn war. But whatever, I would love to see that.
Ooh, I like that a lot.
Yeah, I know you see, man.
I like that a lot.
I always love a good episode of a courtroom drama. We definitely get that. Which leads me to this question for Mr. Bender. As a writer, do you begin with the end in mind? In other words, how, at the very end with her quoting that Starfleet standard or law, all 3 parts, do you have that piece first and you build the story backwards? Or when someone's writing it, are they writing it to get to that point? I almost feel like you've got to have the end in mind before you write that episode.
I think if you can appreciate the complexities or thereof of, let's say, Aaron Sorkin's stage play turned film, A Few Good Men, for example, like, I think you have to know very specifically how you want that ultimate resolution to play out. Like, you have to have that end point. And then your job to keep it compelling for the audience is to create as many obstacles, as many setbacks, or or looks like they're really losing this case, but then they'll and you can go back to Perry Mason and again all these others. So I think even if you haven't, I mean, obviously when you're writing in a forward linear fashion, but you've got to have
Right.
sketched out exactly what you're trying to reach in terms of a guilty or an innocent or whatever, and then you just kind of have to engineer or reverse engineer the various things, the hurdles that you're going to have to be able to jump over, because then it will just make more sense. You don't want to be writing 20, 25 pages of really good, dense legal back and forth and then suddenly realize, oh shoot, I've painted myself into a corner here. What am I supposed to get? So I think you have to start at the
Like a
end.
Star Wars movie, like a Star Wars prequel. I hear what you're saying. Go ahead.
Right, okay. Completely irrelevant. Move to strike. Move to strike. So and what was interesting with Pike, we only get him again for basically the introduction, but he does play a significant role in this because he wants to get off the sidelines and they won't let him, and then the prosecution sort of plays its cards. They're not really interested so much in Una. They've already decided what they're going to do with her, but they'd love to get Pike on the conspiracy charges and clean, the idea being, and so suddenly he's in jeopardy, as is anybody else on the crew. Well, they were loyal to Pike, ergo they must be bad apples. So it's an interesting late turn, and I mean they've got him dead to rights too. I mean, he doesn't have a plausible cover story until this attorney comes up with the asylum pitch that ultimately sort of saves the day. But I mean, he stands to lose his commission or get drummed out of Starfleet if they were to press forward there. And to talk about explaining a character through economy, deeds rather than words, when he's waiting on a hostile environment to speak to the attorney because humans can't survive the atmospheric conditions. He's sitting there, and the secretary is obviously don't let him in, and he's willing to go down to basically the end of his oxygen level. He's basically putting his life on the line in that moment for Una with barely any dialogue, but the stubbornness and conviction that he shows right there, at what lengths he's willing to go for a fellow crew member, and in particular Una, and then the next scene they've readjusted the atmosphere and he can breathe. But it says a lot about Pike and what he as a character, but does so again with an economy. It's not a 4-page speech where he's singing her praises. It's instead just this simple gesture that basically threatens to kill him. But and then the secretary freaks out and goes to get her boss. So.
But there's almost some bookends to that in a sense. I think that's a great point because you see how stubborn and tough he can be at the beginning, and then at the end, he can't help himself but embrace her when they're alone.
Yes.
And kind of backs off because I think sometimes, or I could see someone thinking, there's some kind of tension between the two of them. There's some kind of love. That is a brother sister, best friend relationship that we're witnessing, and
Right.
I think that's important, and I think you see that soft side of him at the end when he hugs her and then kind of backs off for a second. Here's the other thing that I think is really, really important about this episode, because this plays into any other Trek thing we've watched. They established captain's discretion at the highest level. Like, they've really established that. We think that captains go rogue sometimes. I think we even had this discussion at one point. No, there's captain's discretion, and that's an important part of the job. But I think that's something that all great leaders have. Sometimes you have to bend the rules. Sometimes you have to, even if it's for one person. A great leader is not, at least in my opinion, you're not always going to take the letter of the law and hold it all the time. You've got to do that you got to bend it to either establish relationships or win one for the team, or whatever it takes. And I really think that idea of a captain's discretion is established with this episode, and obviously he's going to play forward with everything else we see. I think that's an important piece too. Great episode, and not a shot fired, I don't think either, which is
No.
Amazing.
a big deal.
A huge deal for Star Trek. Not very rare is there not a shot fired. Although I will say that with regard to the bending the rules, it's amazing to see how far Earth-based systems of government, because I think you could argue Starfleet is, how far they come as like a conglomerated, affiliation. So you think of global powers. Well, this is the Federation power. This goes beyond just global power of Earth. And the last global power of Earth that had the opportunity to make a real definition of captain's discretion that we see in film or TV is where they punish John Candy in Cool Runnings. So that just shows such a growth. So let's just say that the Jamaican bobsled team of 2275 or whatever year this is has a real chance. But I think the other cool thing about this episode, because we keep going back to how they've diminished the captain of the Enterprise in the first 2 episodes of this season, I think that's intentional. Because obviously we know where his story is headed. And, the journey is what's going to matter here. And he'll have more shining star moments. I mean, I think that goes without saying. But these other characters that aren't present in the original series, they're the ones that the stories really matter. Like, we know how Captain Pike's life goes. We know where Spock's going to end up. We know where Uhura's going to end up. We don't know about Una Chin Riley. We don't know about, La'an Noonien Singh. We don't know about some of these other tertiary characters. And lest we forget, Ortegas, still has not really had a moment to shine. I expect
this season, I would think.
I would expect this season's going to have probably some Ortegas heavy stories. So they're kind of, I don't want to say buttoning up some loose ends from season 1, but they're kind of resetting the stage a bit here. And I think episode 3-4 is usually in these short season type, let's call them productions. That's usually when we see a turn, a real canon episode. So I would expect that next episode, it's going to be a Monster of the Week. But it's going to be, a character development that's going to influence the rest of this season. So I want to get your guys' opinions, because my opinion is that it's going to be Ortegas. And no matter how the rest of the season plays out with the Gorn or the Klingons or whatever alien race we may run into that becomes the big bad this season, I think Ortegas is going to be the one that kind of leads the charge. Now, maybe not the primary arc of the season, because I do think it's going to be weekly episodic, but I think that's going to be the character that informs a lot of what we see moving forward. So do you guys agree, or do you have another character in mind that you think is going to be our driver?
I would like for it to be Ortegas, because I think I'm anxious to know more about her and her enthusiasm and what makes her tick. I have a suspicion it could be Lon, just because she appears as a complicated onion already, and so you just know there's more to unpeel in terms of what drives her. And this episode, you're related to Khan Noonien Singh. Like, I feel like that's someone that's going to have, I think as Una takes a step back now and will assume more traditional number 1 roles and things like that, I think we'll see more of Lon and hopefully Ortegas. Because again, in season 1, we got a good dose of Mabenga with his daughter. And obviously Spock is going to be, interspersed throughout these places. And Pike got to, his questioning the past was the focus of the season 1 finale, in terms of trying to perhaps alter or change, the future. I do want to add a quick side note on that. We didn't really touch into it. I loved the Star Trek 2 uniform that the older Pike was wearing in the season finale. It was a great costume choice, I thought. And in this episode in the courtroom, we saw M'Benga and Spock, everyone in their dress blues. Like, it was interesting, again, not the traditional costumes that we normally see, but on the stand, they were at their naval best, Starfleet naval best there. So yes, I would welcome an Ortega's forward discovery. I think Lon is still going to play something in that here, and I think the genetics. I don't think we're done with it, but we may now sort of shift to why her name is hyphenated and what that price is or cost. Does that mean that we see some of her relatives? I'm just asking questions. I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. I agree with John Bender there on all those points. I'm trying to think about. I know I keep making these references to Star Wars, but I think it's an important point, and I know we talk about it a lot. But too bad, I'm going to talk about it again. To Urza's point, we do know the main characters. We know where Pike is headed. We know where Spock is headed. We know all that. But I'm so curious as what's going to happen to these characters that we really didn't know existed before, in a sense. But that's a testament to the great writing, because I don't know where it's going to go. And though I continuously rip on Star Wars, the prequels, and the pod racing, even though we knew where those characters were going to go, the path was so predictable and defined. I think that's what kind of rubbed me the wrong way about some of that stuff. Where here, I don't think the path, we know where it's going to go, but it hasn't been predictable. I'm sorry, it hasn't. It's not very defined. And I'm okay with that. I think that's what makes it, it makes it better. Again, there's things about the prequels that are good. But if you want to talk about greatness, and I said it today in a message to the two of you, we are seeing television greatness. We are, and it's because of the writing, and it's because it's unpredictable. I think all those pieces play into it.
Absolutely.
And by the way, one last thing, Patrick Stewart, LeVar Burton, and Jonathan Frakes want one final movie. They've been saying that the past couple days. Those reports are out there. Make it so.
Make it so, indeed. And with that, I think is a perfect segue to our
Of course it is.
ratings out of 7 warp cores for episodes 1 and 2. Now, I felt that this was a 2-parter, personally, because we're getting 2 halves of the crew, essentially. But we're going to rate them independently, because they are technically independent episodes. And screw it. It's my call.
There you go.
Out of 7 warp cores, Lord Uther, how did you feel about our season openers?
Man, I've been trying to decide if I'm going to be super picky or not, because I've obviously already said what bothered me about the first one. I'm going to push all that to the side. I'm going to give it 7 out of 7. I was going to go 6.75, but I'm going to go 7 out of 7 on the first episode, and easily the second episode. There is no even wavering. That's another 7 out of 7 in my opinion. So double 7s there. Bender.
I think both of these episodes, and I had an issue sometimes with Game of Thrones, where they'd start a new season, and it always felt like they weren't quite up to speed out of the gate. Like, it always felt like we had to spend so much time resetting the board that I really didn't feel like they really hit their stride until an episode or 2 into the new run. I think here they hit the ground running. I think these 2 episodes can match with any of your favorites from the first season, and I think they stand on their own against any of your new Trek favorites, Picard, Discovery, where have you. I think these are two very, very good hours of television that can be appreciated by the devotee or just the casual viewer. They may scratch their head at a few references, but they're going to get the gist. So if you can pull that off, and again, there's not the sense of behind the scenes turmoil or lack of continuity, or we have different voices in the room, ergo it sounds and looks and feels different. I think those earn a couple of 7s for me.
Just real quick, that's an excellent point, because there's no time wasted, and that's kind of what happened with Game of Thrones, along with crappy writing at the end, which we continuously harp on that, but I think it's an extremely important point. You can have all the special effects in the world. If you don't have great writing, you waste all of it, Star Wars. And so, but I think that's an excellent point about not having to do any type of catch-up or reestablishment or anything like that, which is what's making the series great. Sorry, Urz, I just had to reinforce.
No, I was actually
point.
going to bring up the same point. I couldn't agree more. I
Because
think
you're both geniuses. This is great.
this is the simpatico nature of the Warp Core podcast here.
Yes.
I think this is where, you know, they express some frustration making this series because they only get 10 episodes. There's so much they could do and they want to do, but they have to pare every second, every frame down to the absolute essentials because they're only given 10 episodes. They only get essentially 10 hours, give or take, of screen time. So everybody's got to share, but everything has to really hit you. And I think in every conceivable way, these first 2 episodes nail it. I mean, I know I'm known for giving things glowing reviews, but for me, these are both 7 out of 7s. I have no issues with the season opener. I think that was a perfect episode of television. I think they treated every aspect of that in a way that was true to Trek, but also fresh and new and exciting and different. And they brought in a lot of nostalgia there with the blood wine and the Klingons celebrating the way Klingons celebrate, and oh, you're not a typical Vulcan. It's like, oh, I mean, wonderful. The second episode, again, classic Star Trek setup. You knew that Rebecca Romijn's character was not going to be written off the series in the second episode of the second season. That'd be a waste of Rebecca Romijn. And certainly you don't want, you know, Caroline Iceberg taking her place. You want Romijn, always. And I thought that they treated that with humor and just true intrigue. I mean, honestly, in a way that does speak to current affairs, which is very Star Trek. And again, I think they treated it respectfully. I think they respected the audience not to be so dumb that they had to be beaten over the head with the message. But at the same time, they didn't make it so, you know, direct a corollary that, you know, you wouldn't enjoy it if you're of a certain persuasion. Insert your topical humor wherever you want there. And I think that's something that Next Generation did very well too. I actually just started rewatching Next Generation this week, and I just got through. It took me a while because with kids I have a tendency to fall asleep or get distracted, and I just got through the first opener with Q and the trial, you know, the whole Farpoint mission, and it's essentially the same thing. You know, right out of the gate, it's like, whoa, are they gonna like write off like these major characters? Is this the Cage all over again, where they change out the captain because, you know, Patrick Stewart wanted to wear a wig? Like, I don't know. And I think that they treated that situation really well. But where that episode had flaws, like they tried to use that like dimming aspect on the top of the camera in a couple of situations so you couldn't see the whole frame. Classic TOS move, right? Obviously, they don't do that here because we have better cameras and better sets and what have you. But, you know, they really kept it pretty tried and true to how Star Trek would view somebody on trial. But instead of being on the Enterprise, or in a, was it 21st century court or 22nd century court, we get, a very modern, futuristic setting, but feels very like Kirk the Admiral sitting there in the Enterprise questioning Spock. You know, again, it's a mirror for what we know is going to happen with Pike. I loved it. I mean, I couldn't. Again, I'm a gusher. I'm absolutely a whole box of gushers for these two episodes. I loved it. I love the cast and crew. They're doing an amazing job. The writers, I think, have all of the hats that the Warp Core podcast desperately needs to wear off right now, because it's just that wonderful a series so far. With that, we have boldly went into a new season of Strange New Worlds, and we will boldly go where no Warp Core podcast has been before, because these episodes are brand new and we haven't talked about them yet. Next time, we will talk more Season 2. I want to thank John Bender for joining us this week. Lord Uther, as always, I am UrzaMaster. We are the Warp Core podcast, wishing you long life and prosperous one.